The U.S. is the world's undisputed economic powerhouse. It has the highest GDP on the planet. Its currency is the global reserve used for trade around the world, at least for now, and for centuries it's been the place people flock to in order to build a better life for themselves. If you live in America today, unless you're indigenous, it's because someone in your ancestry came here to build a better life. That has made America a unique nation, a place brought together by the desire to make things better and by a desire to make things. America has been the leader in innovation for more than a century, and the results can be seen in the massive corporations that have dominated the world: General Motors, IBM, Apple, Google, Amazon. And yet today something has gone seriously wrong in America's economy. The government has run up a public debt of $33 trillion, far more than any other country. Productivity is on the decline and homelessness is on the rise. Housing affordability is the worst it's been in generations, and for young homebuyers today, housing is a crisis. With nowhere to house new arrivals, cities are struggling with a massive migrant problem. There are jobs to be had, but they don't pay enough to cover the cost of living. Numerous Americans are working 2 or 3 jobs just to pay their bills. So how did the United States get into this situation, and is there any hope it can get out? To answer these questions, we will need to wind back the clock all the way to the 1960s. Back then, it was possible to raise a family in the U.S. on a single blue-collar income. Even a simple, low-skilled job like pumping gas at a local gas station could earn you enough money to own your own home and raise a family. So what changed? One major element is government spending. Back then in the 1960s, the U.S. was fighting a very expensive war in Vietnam, which was also taking the lives of young American men. At the same time, President Lyndon Johnson instituted his Great Society policies, a network of welfare programs designed to help the poorest in America, especially those living in minority communities. The impact of those programs is debated to this day. Some say it was a huge boost to America's poorest households and pulled many out of misery and poverty. Others argued it led to the decline of the family in low-income areas, leading to the crime problems seen in the inner cities from the 1970s onwards. Whatever your take may be on these programs, one thing is clear: they were expensive, and their cost, combined with the cost of the Vietnam War, caused the U.S. to start running huge deficits. At that time, the U.S. dollar was pegged to the value of gold. For decades, $35 bought you 1 ounce of gold. It was one of the reasons the U.S. dollar was the global reserve currency. The whole world trusted the U.S. dollar because ultimately it was a promissory note that entitled the bearer to a certain amount of gold held in U.S. reserves. But with the U.S. running up huge deficits and the Federal Reserve issuing more and more currency to cover those deficits, faith in the U.S. dollar began to weaken. In 1971, the French government, which had accumulated billions of U.S. dollars selling goods to America, announced it was planning to trade in those dollars for gold from the U.S.'s reserves. Worried that this would start a run on the U.S.'s gold reserves, President Richard Nixon announced that he was decoupling the U.S. dollar from the value of gold. The U.S. dollar would become a fiat currency. Fiat is a Latin term meaning a government order or decree. In other words, the U.S. dollar would have value because the U.S. government said so. From that point on, the U.S. dollar went into a devaluation tailspin. When a currency devalues, the people who use that currency experience that devaluation as inflation. Everything begins to cost more and more. In the 1970s and 1980s, the U.S. saw its worst inflation bout since the American Revolution. By the early 1980s, the value of an ounce of gold had gone from $35 per ounce to over $600 per ounce. Put another way, the U.S. dollar lost nearly 95% of its value against gold in a single decade. And today, gold is just under $2,000 per ounce, meaning the U.S. dollar has lost 98% of its value against gold. That level of inflation could have crushed the U.S. consumer, but back in the 1970s and 1980s, unions were powerful in America, and they demanded that employers give cost of living increases to employees. This constant raising of wages kept the inflation cycle going, making it harder to tamp down rising prices, but it also meant that people's wages kept up with inflation. Not everyone was unionized. In fact, only about a quarter of American workers back then belonged to a union, but it gave unions a lot of power in the market. Rising prices among unionized workers meant that other workers could also demand higher wages. But the cycle of wage increases and the inflation pressures it created prompted many political leaders to turn their backs on unions. A new generation of politicians, such as Margaret Thatcher in Great Britain and Ronald Reagan in America, rose to power, and they fought against the influence of unions. Many U.S. states passed right-to-work laws that allowed workers to choose whether or not they would join the union that operated in their workplace. This campaign to weaken unions worked. The share of American workers who belonged to a union dropped from 25% in the 1970s 1970s to just over 10% today. That helped to tame inflation, and by the mid-1990s, inflation had slowed to around 2 or 3%, but it also meant that many people's wages stopped keeping up with the rising cost of living. Today, nearly 50 years after Nixon took the US dollar off the gold standard, the inflation-adjusted average wage in America is only slightly higher than it was back then. American households have been running in place for more than 50 years. Meanwhile, the US government's deficit spending has only grown and grown. Since 1971, the value of the US federal government's debt has grown from around 35% of the value of the US economy to more than 100% of the value of the US economy today. And the government's own projections show that if nothing changes in the government's behavior, that will rise to 200% within the next 30 years. America is an unbelievably indebted nation. The main thing that has kept this debt manageable over all these decades is that America is a highly innovative nation, and it has managed to grow its productivity throughout all that time. Productivity is an important concept that gets very little attention in the media. In simplest terms, it's the amount of output in dollar terms for every hour worked in the economy. America's huge innovations in technology over the past 50 years, mainly centered around computers, communications technology, and the internet, have made American workers far more productive than they used to be. There's a direct correlation between productivity and wealth. Because American businesses are so much more productive than they used to be, they pay higher taxes, and that allows the government to cover the cost of its enormous debt. But for American workers, wages haven't kept up with productivity growth. If the wages American workers get paid had kept up with productivity growth, the average American today would be earning 3.5 times as much money as they're actually earning. Decades of neoliberal policies that favored businesses over households have meant that businesses and their executives and owners have taken all the gains from increased productivity, while those doing the work have gotten nothing. For the wealthy and for corporations, income has kept up with productivity growth, and that is why America today is seeing such a huge disparity in wealth and income. But because rich people and corporations have a lot of pricing power in the economy, many things have soared in price relative to the average American wage. Healthcare, education, and housing now eat up a much larger share of household income than they used to. Let's take a look at just one of these problems: housing. Recent surveys have shown that housing affordability is now worse than it was at the height of the US's housing bubble some 15 years ago, and the worst it's been in 2 generations. How did America get to this place? For one thing, the construction of new housing collapsed to a fraction of what it used to be, despite the fact that the US population is growing, up by 1.2 million people in 2022 alone. Between 2010 and 2019, the US built fewer new homes than it did in any prior decade, in data going back to the 1960s. Even in the 1960s, when the US population was a third smaller than it is today, America was building more homes. Part of this decline has to do with the housing bubble bust 15 years ago. The bust caused some developers to go bankrupt, and the rest pulled back on home construction. But there are other larger causes for this problem. In American cities today, zoning laws are preventing the construction of new and affordable homes. In the typical American metro area today, more than 80% of residential land is zoned exclusively for single-family homes, while less than 20% of land can be used for building more affordable housing options like apartments, townhouses, and even duplexes. Many suburban cities have a complete ban on building anything other than single-family homes. The construction of starter homes has collapsed. Starter homes are smaller houses like bungalows that used to be the first home a family bought, before trading up to something larger as their income and family grew. In the 1980s, 40% of newly built houses were starter homes. Today, only around 7% of new builds are starter homes. This is the result of policy. In many suburban cities, there are minimum lot sizes. For instance, in Cupertino, California, home of Apple Computer, a developer has to devote 5,000 square feet of land for every new home built. In the nearby city of Atherton, the minimum lot size is 1 acre, more than 43,000 square feet of land per new home. If a developer has to buy lots that are large to build homes, they're going to build large, luxurious homes, not starter homes. And that's intentional. Minimum lot sizes and zoning rules are a way for wealthy and middle-class cities to keep lower-income people from moving in. And the data shows that these cities are predominantly white. Today, it's illegal to prevent black families from moving into a neighborhood, but there's nothing stopping a city from zoning land that prevents lower-income black families from moving in. This is a subtle form of racism that exists in America to this day. These exclusionary zoning laws even make it difficult to build apartment buildings. Many cities have minimum parking space requirements. For instance, if you build build a 100-unit apartment building, a developer may have to surround that building with 200 parking spaces. This means that they have to buy a much larger plot of land than the apartment building will actually occupy. Because of the cost, developers tend to build luxury apartment buildings that middle and low-income people can't afford. And today, the monetary policies of the U.S. Federal Reserve are making things even worse. During the COVID pandemic, the Fed dropped interest rates to rock-bottom levels to stimulate the economy. That made mortgages cheap. During the pandemic, the average rate on a 30-year mortgage fell to below 3%. This gave homebuyers an enormous amount of buying power. The lower the interest rate, the higher the house price you can afford for the same monthly payment. Not surprisingly, house prices soared. But the Fed also did something else. It printed billions in new dollars in order to make up for the economic crisis caused by pandemic lockdowns. That freshly printed money prevented a massive economic collapse thanks to government handouts, but it also led to inflation. When inflation hit, the Fed started raising interest rates. Today, the average rate on a 30-year mortgage is just short of 8%. With mortgage rates more than doubling in the space of a year and a half, homebuyers' purchasing power has dropped like a rock. But house prices haven't. That's because the supply of homes on the market has shrunk severely. With mortgage rates so high, homeowners who got mortgages during the low rates era don't want to move into a new home. It would mean getting a new and much more expensive mortgage. Many American homeowners are now trapped in their homes waiting for the day when interest rates drop again so they can afford to move. And the lack of supply means the home buyers who are in the market are desperate and driving up the prices of the homes they want to buy. It's the worst of both worlds: extremely expensive mortgages and high and rising house prices. The housing market has become completely dysfunctional. Not surprisingly, the housing affordability problem is causing homelessness to soar. In 2023, America saw its biggest ever increase in homelessness. The number of people without a home jumped by 11% in a year. But the country is facing yet another problem. The long period of rising productivity that has made corporations richer and allowed the government to pay off its debts seems to be coming to an end. In 2022 and 2023, the U.S. saw 5 consecutive quarters of declining productivity. In the first quarter of 2023, productivity dropped by a staggering 2.7%. This is the worst decline in productivity that the United States has seen in at least 75 years. There are plenty of jobs in America today, but each of those jobs is producing fewer goods and services. That's a very bad sign because declining productivity means less wealth creation, and less wealth creation means more people get poorer. The experts are offering many explanations for why this is happening. Some blame the new trend of working from home. They say workers who sit in front of their computer at home in their pajamas are less productive than workers in an office. Some say the tight labor market is the problem. With unemployment so low, businesses are hiring workers who are less productive, and that's dragging down the productivity of the economy as a whole. Others blame the Great Resignation, the trend that existed in the wake of the pandemic where many people quit their jobs. That led to businesses having to hire new workers who are inexperienced in their jobs and need training. While they train, they are less productive than experienced workers. Whatever the reasons for the decline in productivity, we can be sure that it will be bad news going forward. Declining productivity will mean lower wages in the future, and with that, a lower quality of life. It will also mean that U.S. households will have a harder time paying off their debts, such as mortgages, student loans, and credit cards. Life could soon be much worse for the average American. It will also be bad news for the government, which will have a harder time paying off the U.S.'s massive public debt. Those high interest rates from the Fed are also causing the government's debt payments to soar, and this year, the interest alone on America's debt will cost more than $1 trillion. That's more than the U.S. spends on its massive bloated defense budget. If America's productivity keeps declining and interest rates stay high, the country could be facing an unprecedented debt crisis, both within the government and within households. In short, decades of poor planning and bad policies are catching up with America. If the country doesn't change course soon, the 21st century could be remembered as the era when the United States went into terminal decline and lost its title of world's economic powerhouse. To learn more about America's explosive debt problem, check out this video here. And if this video brought value to you, please consider liking and subscribing. Thanks for watching.